Good morning, boys and girls. It's Mrs. K. I miss you so much. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read from a chapter book every day, and you guys can hear me and watch me, just like we do after lunch. Charlotte's Web, the book we were working on, I left it at school. So I found a bunch of books at home that Robert and Katrina read when they were roughly your age. And this series is called The Littles. Have a good look at the book. You see the pictures, and I'll show you the back. Now, Mrs. K, before she opened the book, was thinking to herself, she was wondering what this book would be about. Are you wondering? Well, let's start reading and find out. Remember, you can do a lot of visualizing as I'm reading because a lot of these chapter books don't have pictures. The Littles and their amazing new friend. As you can see too, Mrs. K doesn't have a rocking chair, so I'm going to sit in my big comfy chair in my den. And it's by John Peterson. The Littles and their amazing new friend. Cousin Dinky Little was on the Big's roof doing their final testing of a hot air balloon. 10-year-old Tom Little and his Uncle Nick were watching him as he worked. Tom had found the huge red rubber balloon in Henry Big's water basket and had given it to his cousin, an adventurer and a glider pilot. "You were right to think I need this balloon, Tom," said Dinky. "I've been wanting a big one like this for some time. If everything goes right, I'll be able to fly our family to the city on Thanksgiving to have dinner with our friends at the library. But first, I have to see if Grandpa's stovetop pump really works." Grandpa Amos Little and the family's patriarch, explorer, and inventor had used his noodle, as he called it, to invent the stove pump that could blow out hot air steadily into the balloon. "Hot air rises," explained Cousin Dinky, "so the balloon should go up in the air when a valve is open and down when it's closed. We'll find out pretty soon if it works." The Littles were tiny people who lived in an apartment in the walls of a big house owned by Mr. George W. Big, a regular-sized person. The Big family had no idea that the tiny Littles were living in their house. The 10 members of the tiny family stayed out of sight, made very little noise, and always put their trash in the garbage disposal hole in the kitchen sink so as not to leave a telltale mess anywhere. The Littles called themselves House Tinies. They were not just small, they were very, very tiny. The tallest Little and the father of the family, Mr. William T. Little, was only 6 inches tall. The smallest Little, Baby Betsy, slept in a small little box. Except for being tiny, the Littles were very much like regular-sized people, with one amazing but unimportant physical difference. The Littles and all the tiny people of the Big Valley had tails. Their tails were ornamental, not useful. They couldn't hang by their tails, nor did they ever swish them to keep the flies away as horses and cows do. All tiny persons were proud of their tails and tried not to drag them on the floor or in the mud. And most importantly, they were always careful not to step on one another's tails. The time finally came when Cousin Dinky was ready to make the first test of Grandpa Little's stove pump. As Dinky hummed a song off key, he lit a fire in the heating unit, which was attached to the inside of the basket. It was a quart-sized strawberry basket made of very thin wood. The basket was the part of the aircraft that hung under the red balloon. Now there are little pictures on the page I'm going to try to show you of the Littles. When the fire was hot enough, Dinky opened the hot air valve. Air was pumped through a tube into the limp balloon, filling it up. Strings from the basket attached to the roof kept the balloon from flying. Cousin Dinky saw at once that the hot air was going into the balloon much too fast. He needed to make some adjustments. First, he tried to put on the fire by closing off the heat pump, but a nut and bolt were struck, allowing the hot air to continue flowing into the balloon. The balloon lurched forward as the superheated air entered it. "Quick, Tom, follow me," yelled Uncle Nick. "We need to get into the basket to add some weight." Tom jumped in after Uncle Nick. "Are the 3 of us heavy enough to keep the balloon on the roof?" Tom asked. Just as they got into the basket, Dinky jumped out. "I've got to get my wrench to shut off this stuck valve," he said. That was a mistake. Without Dinky's weight, the balloon jumped abruptly into the sky, breaking all but one of the holding strings. The balloon tipped, and almost everything inside that wasn't fastened down was dumped out. Tom and Uncle Nick held on tightly to the basket to keep it from falling out too. And here's a picture of that. When he saw what was happening, Cousin Dinky leaped for the basket, but he couldn't reach it. Dinky ran to the one string that still held down the balloon. Just as he got there, the string broke. Up went the balloon like a shot. Dinky immediately threw the wrench up into the air where it fell into the basket. "This might come in handy," he called to Uncle Nick. The balloon rose quickly into the sky. Tom held on to the edge of the basket and looked down. "Uncle Nick!" he yelled. Everything looked so small. "I can't even see Cousin Dinky anymore." The aircraft was bobbing about and raising fast. The two littles tried to think about what Cousin Dinky had told them about how to fly the balloon. What were they supposed to do with the wrench? All they could remember was that to make the balloon go higher, they had to throw out some of the pebbles used as weights. To make it go down, they had to release some of the hot air out of the balloon. They had no control of the directions the balloon went. That depended on which way the wind was blowing. "Wait a second," yelled Tom. "I just remembered. Yeah, I got it." He looked up and pointed. Cousin Dinky said there's a valve at the top where the hot air can be let out of the balloon. Uncle Nick ran to the edge of the basket, hung onto the railing, and leaned out away from the balloon. There was a string dangling right in front of him. He pulled it. The valve on top of the balloon opened. They immediately stopped rising and began to drop slowly. After a while, Uncle Nick saw the green forest very close underneath them. They were about to crash into the trees. Uncle Nick quickly closed the valve a little, hoping this would give them a little bit of a lift to keep them above the treetops. "That's it," he yelled, nodding his head and smiling. "We might be able to figure this thing out, Tom." It was then that Uncle Nick saw the brook beneath them. "Tom!" he yelled. He pointed down. "I think that's the same brook that goes past the Biggs' house. We could follow it back home if we don't get blown off course." The balloon continued to fly where the wind pushed it. Uncle Nick and Tom saw a clearing in the woods where a balloon could land. Nick opened and closed the hot air valve, trying to keep the balloon from rising or falling too fast. Then a small hill, big to the tinies, rose up in front of them. In order to keep them from crashing into the trees, Uncle Nick shut the upper valve all the way so the balloon could rise quickly. Then, suddenly, the balloon got caught in a warm updraft and shot up the hill in a hurry. The forest below them was wildly tangled and dark. Tom and Uncle Nick had never seen such a scary, overgrown wild place. Every now and then, Tom had a glimpse of running water through the trees. "Good, we're still following the brook," he said. Finally, the warm air in the balloon lifted the basket all the way up the side of the hill to the very top. At that point, Tom and Uncle Nick saw a small cleared area stubbed with sharp rocks below and ahead of them. The brook flowed into and out of a small pond before it began its course down the steep hill into the valley. The wind hushed for a moment, and the balloon showed as if it approached the landing place. Hoping not to crash into the rocks of the pond, Uncle Nick pulled down all the way on the hot air valve line to open it completely so the balloon would drop toward the ground quickly. The hot air hissed as it rushed out from the top of the balloon. The air draft drifted down toward the clearing in the woods. As they got closer, the ground appeared to rush up to meet them. The littles, expecting a hard landing, closed their eyes and huddled together. Instead of a bump, the balloon came to a sudden soft stop. The basket tipped over to its side. Tom and Uncle Nick tumbled out onto some soft grass. They were on top of the tiny haystack. As they sat there laughing and hugging each other, a tiny red-headed girl wearing a long old-fashioned dress came running from between the two tall, sharp rocks, carrying a pail of yellowish liquid, which she promptly splashed on the side of the haystack beneath them. She looked up at the two littles. "There's a fire! You two gentlemen should get off the haystack," she said. Then she ran back through the tall rocks with the pail. Tom and Uncle Nick heard a hissing noise and saw smoke rising from the bottom of the haystack. "There is a fire down there," Tom yelled. The two littles slid off the haystack. At this time, a tiny boy wearing breeches, a shirt, and three-cornered hat came running between the two sharp rocks. He was following the tiny girl, who was carrying another pail of yellowish liquid. "Glory!" he shouted at the girl. It's dangerous." And he put the bonnet back on before Father sees you. Now there's a little picture of that, of where they're landing on the haystack. And that's the end of that chapter. So boys and girls, I would like you to think about who the characters are so far in the chapter book called The Littles and Their Amazing New Friend. I'd like you to think about the setting or where the story takes place and what you were visualizing during that chapter. So if you could think about those things and maybe talk to mommy or daddy or your sister or your dog or your cat, and maybe even write a few of those items down. And then when Mrs. K talks to you later, we can talk about it. All right, talk to you later. Till we meet again. Bye.